Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn After the Lab, a look at the processes and obstacles to homing primates used in laboratories and research. My name is Jessica Chapman, and I'll be today's moderator. This webinar is part 2 of After the Lab series and is co-hosted by the TIPS Animal Law Committee and the Animal Law Committee's Science and Technology Subcommittee. We would also like to thank ABA's TIPS section for supporting this webinar series. Feel free to send your questions throughout the presentations, either through the chat function or the Q&A function. We will answer those questions after the presentation ends. You can also watch the recording of part 1 of this webinar series, which discusses homing companion animals after their experience in research in laboratories on the ABA TIPS YouTube channel. Additionally, this webinar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded to the channel as well. And now I'll give brief introductions to our esteemed panelists. Our first panelist, though she won't be the first in order, it'll be Erica Fleury, but it's Amy Foltz, and she is the welfare scientist and director of special projects at Chimp Haven. Amy is a co-founded Chimp Haven in 1995 with many others, and she has worked with chimpanzees for over 25 years. Prior to her work with chimps, she worked with macaques, baboons, and other non-human primates. Amy is responsible for publishing scientific manuscripts and long-range planning for Chimp Haven. Her areas of expertise include the socialization of over 300 chimpanzees, enrichment, positive reinforcement training, observational research, collaboration, and welfare assessments. Amy has extensive professional experience after working in zoos, sanctuaries, and research facilities doing behavioral work. She has also published and presented several scientific papers based on her research and is the recipient of an honorary PhD from Centenary College in Louisiana. Erica Fleury has served as the director of the North American Primate Sanctuary Alliance, or NAPSA, for close to 10 years. NAPSA is a coalition of the leading primate sanctuaries on the continent who care for more than 800 rescued and retired non-human primates. From 2019 to 2022, she led Chimpanzees in Need, NAPSA's $5 million collaborative fundraiser focused on rescuing 40 chimpanzees from a closed refuge in Los Angeles. Chimpanzees in Need then shifted to sanctuary capacity planning. She has been involved with primate sanctuaries since 2006. Additionally, she is the author of Monkey Business, A History of Non-Human Primate Rights, and the Founders, my apologies for misreading that, and various chapters and articles in academic and mass media publications. Most recently, she has had an essay published in Jane Goodall at 90, a book celebrating one of the most well-known primatologists. Erica's work has been featured live on CNN and in the New York Times, National Geographic, podcasts, and other media outlets. She is also honored to use her voice on behalf of the voiceless. And Tim Ajax is the executive director of the Oklahoma Primate Sanctuary, which provides lifelong care for almost 100 monkeys rescued from the pet trade or retired from research. Tim has more than 30 years of experience working hands-on with numerous species of wildlife, including old and new world primates, carnivores, and birds of prey. He has extensive immobilization, enrichment, animal care, and enclosure design experience and moved to the sanctuary in 2018. From February 2009 to July 2018, Tim was the director of the 187-acre Born Free USA Primate Sanctuary, where he oversaw all operations pertaining to the care of more than 550 primates. In 2012, he was a Secretary's Honor Award recipient for his assistance to the USDA and placing more than 100 primates from a bankrupt sanctuary in San Antonio, Texas. And from 1991 to 2009, Tim held multiple positions at Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation, Inc., including Assistant Director and Director of Veterinary Services, where he managed the daily operations of more than 300 sanctuary residents and more than 7,000 wild patients yearly. And with that, I will let Erica take over, and it's all you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get my screen share working. How's that? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. Well, hello. I am Erica Fleury, and I'm very excited to be here with you today with my esteemed co-presenters on today's webinar. I will preface this with a little comment that I currently am very pregnant, and one lovely side effect is diminished lung capacity. So if it seems that I'm huffing and puffing, I apologize. I will try to keep it to a minimum, but you may notice that, and It's not your imagination. I have served as they explained, I've served as the director of North American Primate Sanctuary Alliance, or NAPSA, for close to 10 years now. Today, I will be talking to you about primate sanctuary retirement and how it works. My presentation is called Hey, Hey, It's the Monkeys Filling Up Sanctuaries, because that's the state of primate sanctuaries in this country at this time. And I've always been a big fan of the monkeys, so why not have a little fun with it? So, first, a little bit about NAPSA. NAPSA was founded in 2010 by the founders of 6 chimpanzee sanctuaries in the interest of speaking with one unified voice on the matters that impacted them all. A few years later, NAPSA's circle of consideration grew to focus on the proper treatment of all non-human primates, and monkey sanctuaries began joining. We currently have 8 member sanctuaries throughout the continent who collectively care for close to 800 primates. NAPSA requires GFAS accreditation, or AZA sanctuary certification, for membership. Other membership requirements are that the sanctuaries are not open to the public, there be no breeding, selling, or trading of animals, no exploitation of any kind, and we even ask that our members adhere to standards set by the IUCN Primate Specialist Group's best practice guidelines for responsible images of non-human primates. What that does is it requires them to show barriers between humans and non-humans in every photo, show appropriate PPE being used, and to clarify that historical images showing humans holding or posing with primates, if shared, were taken when standards were different. We know better now, and we do better. The Alliance is focused on advocacy work to end exploitation, speaking collectively on behalf of our members, and serving as a liaison to facilitate primate placement in sanctuaries. And that's really what I'm here to talk to you about today. So, though in the early days, NAPSA was focused on promoting primate sanctuary retirement as the best option for a primate's welfare, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to many of you that the tide has shifted, and we now have more requests for placement than space. We find ourselves focused less on selling the idea of primate retirement or convincing primate owners to retire their animals to sanctuary, and more time on fielding those requests and trying to find solutions that work. Every year, the amount of requests grows, and the species involved shift a little. Different species of primates are more popular in different industries. So what you're looking at here is from July 2021 to June 2023, NAPSA was approached to house a total of 1,646 primates. This graph shows the breakdown by general species, though you can see that I've had to leave out of the data 1,500 long-tailed macaques that were illegally imported for research and confiscated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the reason why I left them out is because if I had them on the graph, everything else would be so tiny and it would be hard for you to see what I'm talking about here. So note that NAPSA also works to end the use of primates in entertainment, but typically that has involved more apes and less monkeys in the US. And the use of apes in entertainment has virtually ended in the last few years. Hence, there were no placement requests from that industry reflected on the graph for this time period. It's important to note here that the species most in need of placement currently are macaques, lemurs, and capuchins, as well as spider monkeys and marmosets. Not surprisingly, these are the species most in use in laboratory research and in the pet trade. When a placement request comes through to me, I gather some pertinent information, like the animal's age, their history of ownership, their social history, and funding available for their care. And then I approach sanctuaries. I start with the NAPSA member sanctuaries, and then I work down a list of other sanctuaries that may not be NAPSA members, but are still highly qualified, trustworthy, stable, and meet our requirements for appropriate care. Some of them are GFAS accredited and some are not. Most sanctuaries will ask for funding to accompany the new arrivals, but not all will. The owner of the animal is generally expected to provide transportation to the sanctuary. This chart shows all the sources of the placement requests received during that period of 2021 to 2023, including the 1,500 macaques confiscated from lab research. It was atypical for this many primates to need placement during 1 year from research, but I felt it important to show the real data that we worked with. And it's important to note too that not all requests for placement come through NAPSA. Some go to other go directly to sanctuaries, and some go to sanctuaries that are not in touch with me. So this is a piece of the pie here. What I want you to take away from this is that besides the 1,500 macaques from research, there have been a large number of placement requests also from failed sanctuaries and zoos, including roadside zoos. That is why NAPSA is such a staunch supporter of full GFAS accreditation for sanctuaries and AZA accreditation for zoos, because those accreditation systems have much higher standards than others that are out there and can help facilities protect themselves from having to give up all their animals suddenly if they are to encounter some hiccups, putting the welfare of them all at risk and putting an additional strain on the responsibly run facilities whose services are already in high demand. In the last 2 years, only 34 primates of the 1,646 were able to find placement solutions through NAPSA. Again, others could have been placed through other sanctuaries, but this is what NAPSA observed. Some of those didn't even go through all the way because the owners changed their minds about handing their pets over to sanctuaries, or because labs were unable to finance what would be needed to make it work. What hinders most placements from happening is lack of available space at sanctuaries due to funding, and the lack of funding so that the sanctuaries can expand to better meet the need. Sanctuaries have the land space, the physical space, but need the funding in order to build, get staffing, veterinary care, et cetera, to better meet this need. Sanctuaries want to take more monkeys and say yes more often, but the reputable ones must carefully consider their limits and not overextend their resources. Now, I've mentioned monkeys a lot today, and apes not as much. And there's a number of reasons why the demand to house monkeys right now in sanctuaries is so much greater than that of apes in this country. You'll hear more from Amy Fultz about when the demand to house apes was higher and how that has been resolved a little bit, but is still a work in progress very much. When we talk about apes in captive exploitive situations in the US, we're really talking about chimpanzees. That species was always used in greater numbers in the pet trade, entertainment, and laboratory research than other apes like gorillas and orangutans. To show what I mean, there are currently about 740 chimps in accredited sanctuaries in the US. But NAPSA member Center for Great Apes is the only sanctuary with orangutans, and they have 27. Big difference there. And there are no gorillas in sanctuaries because there just isn't the need to house them. The need is for chimpanzees when it comes to apes. While there are still about 250 chimpanzees who we foresee will eventually need sanctuary placement, that's it. There is a finite population that in general is not breeding and will not be replenished. I think Amy will be explaining the reasons why. NAPSA is in the middle of leading a capacity planning project called Chimpanzees in Need, and that involves population modeling through Lincoln Park Zoo, and we can see that the end is near for chimpanzee exploitation. We have learned that in approximately 57 years, there will no longer be a need to house chimpanzees in sanctuaries. This is huge. Sanctuary populations of chimpanzees will be extinct. As exciting as that is, that we're witnessing the end of chimpanzee exploitation in this country, when we look at the situation for monkeys, it is much more sobering. Monkeys are being bred in numbers so high that there's actually no reliable data for how many monkeys are being sold in the pet trade, transported around the country, and living in roadside zoos and pseudo sanctuaries. While some states prohibit or limit primate ownership, others do not. And we see those areas as a hotbed for the placement requests that come through me. As a result, NAPSA frequently works with other advocacy groups to educate the public about the harms of keeping primates as pets and to support the legal progress that's so important that limits private ownership and public contact opportunities. Most likely, most of the monkeys living in the US are in laboratories, but the sad fact is that most of those are never intended to leave the lab. Though there are statistics about how many monkeys are in labs, we have seen this number climb in recent years due to the increased demand for research, some of it spurred by COVID-19. Monkeys in laboratories are usually recycled into other studies or euthanized. A small percentage make it out to sanctuary retirement, thanks to determined researchers fighting for this. And I bet Tim will be talking about that too later in this webinar. but most monkeys living in labs will never get to live anywhere else. NAPSA does field requests to place monkeys from laboratories, and most of the time, those placements fail to take place because the researchers are unprepared or unwilling to provide the funding that a sanctuary would need to care for a monkey or a group of monkeys. Despite NAPSA's work and everyone else's work, trying to educate researchers about the need to plan for funding for upcoming retirements. So NAPSA and individual sanctuaries and other advocacy groups have been trying to improve this situation for decades. Here's just a few of the more recent examples of NAPSA's outreach to researchers and the general public about the dire need for funding if people wish to retire more primates. You'll see this includes things like presentations at industry conferences. The ASP conferences are overwhelmingly tailored to primate researchers, for example, so that's a good place to go. We've had reports in academic journals and stories in mass media that are designed to reach a wider net of people. We've been sure to refer back to the success stories, and they do exist, where partnerships with labs or researchers who provided funding resulted in successful placements, proving that it can be a real win-win for everyone, but especially for the primates. They're what matters here. So what now? More accredited monkey sanctuaries and more space in existing accredited monkey and chimp sanctuaries, and the more funding to make it all work for all sanctuaries is desperately needed. I say no to placement requests more than I say yes, and I don't like that. Chimpanzee sanctuaries are recognizing this need to house monkeys, and some are already considering how to shift to welcome monkeys in response to that growing need when the need to house chimpanzees has dwindled. So maybe I'm a daydream believer, but I hope collectively advocates can work together to change our culture that has considered primates to be little more than tools for human benefit, and more monkeys can be rescued in the future, and that we can get those chimps that are awaiting placement also to safety. Please reach out to me to discuss anything that I've mentioned here further. If you have questions, you can use all of NAPSA's social media or website contact channels to reach me as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Erica. And now we will move to Amy's presentation.
Hello, everyone. Give me just a minute to get my screen shared here, my presentation up. And thank you all for having me today. As Erica mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more about chimpanzees, and in particular, chimpanzee retirement at Chimp Haven. And I've been at Chimp Haven since 2004, but have been involved since the very beginning, which I'll talk a little bit about. But I'm going to talk a bit about some of the laws that have actually impacted chimpanzee retirement over the years. And kind of one of the first things that has affected chimpanzees was the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Chimps were declared endangered in their country's origin, but they were actually declared threatened in the United States due to lobbying by biomedical research. So that meant that chimpanzees were what we call split listed. So chimpanzees, captive chimpanzees in the United States were considered threatened, and chimps were endangered in their countries of origin, like I said. This is important because it allowed for chimpanzees to be utilized still in biomedical research, as well as being used in some states as pets and also as entertainers. Then in 1975, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, was passed, and this prohibited the importation of chimpanzees. Prior to this, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, chimpanzees were actually being brought into the United States for research in particular. So Chimp Haven, the sanctuary that I've worked for many, many years and helped to co-found, at the time that Chimp Haven was founded, I was actually working in a biomedical research facility doing behavioral work. And at that time, captive breeding programs were funded. This was in the late 80s and early 90s, particularly due to another pandemic, the HIV and AIDS pandemic. There were hundreds of chimpanzees born in the research facilities because of this perceived demand for chimpanzees in HIV and AIDS research. As it turned out, chimpanzees are not a good model for AIDS. They can be infected, but they typically don't get what looks like human AIDS. And we have many chimps at Chimp Haven that were infected with HIV. They don't look or act much different than the other chimpanzees. So this created a surplus population of chimpanzees. And in 1995, the government said, uh-oh, we have too many chimps. These guys can live into their 60s and they're very expensive to care for. And so they put in place a temporary breeding moratorium and said, we aren't going to breed any more chimpanzees. So Erica kind of mentioned in her presentation some of the reasons that the chimps will be, over time, the sanctuaries will be kind of going out of business. Then in 1997, the National Research Council met and had a conversation with chimpanzee researchers, with the National Institutes of Health. There were geneticists involved, a number of people who utilized chimpanzees, and they discussed what to do about this population of chimpanzees that was growing older and wasn't really being utilized as much for research, and there wasn't as much funding out there. The decision was made that chimpanzees would not be euthanized at the end of their research, which is very uncommon for animals utilized in biomedical research. But everybody on the council, except for one dissenting opinion, said, yeah, we need to find a way to retire these chimpanzees so they can live out their lives. So this was sort of the beginning of Chimp Haven. We were co-founded in 1995 as a private nonprofit, and we were responding to this need for long-term care for the chimps. And it was created again by myself, a primatologist, along with other primatologists and veterinarians that were involved in chimpanzee care at the time. So for us, we had legislation that really helped. In 2000, President Clinton signed into being the Chimpanzee Health Improvement, Maintenance, and Protection Act, which was passed by Congress and provided for lifetime care of chimps used in research. And these were chimpanzees that were utilized by the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, or other agencies of the federal government. So chimpanzees that were federally owned or supported. That's important because, as Erica mentioned, there are a lot of chimpanzees out there who are maybe pets or privately owned or in different sorts of situations, and the Chimp Act doesn't cover those chimpanzees. So the Chimp Act created a federally supported sanctuary system. It established Chimp Haven, basically. It also established something called the standards of care, which Chimp Haven has had to follow, which sort of lists like what we are supposed to do and what we can't do, like research. Invasive research is, of course, prohibited, as we would all hope. It also defined cost-sharing requirements with the National Institutes of Health. So, as I mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. So the Chimp Act required matching funds, including 25% of our operating costs, 10% of construction costs, and there was a $30 million lifetime cap on spending. And again, it didn't cover these formerly privately owned chimpanzees. The first chimpanzees arrived at Chimp Haven in 2005. This is Rita and Teresa, and they came from actually the biomedical research facility that I was working at the time. During the first year, Chimp Haven received 31 chimpanzees, and Chimp Haven's known for our forested habitats. These are just some pictures of some of the chimpanzees out in the forested habitats. One of our goals was to have the chimpanzees experience what we'd call species typical behaviors, or doing things that chimpanzees do and living what we like to call the chimp life. So you see Gina eating some elm leaves, you see Karen and some of her friends fishing for fire ants, and you see a chimpanzee nest over here and some of the youngsters climbing in the trees. So other legislation that has helped chimpanzees over the years, and Chimphaven in particular, was an amendment to the original Chimp Act. In the original Chimp Act, there was a clause that said that chimpanzees could go back into biomedical research if needed by the national government. And this led to difficulties for funding in some cases for us. And we also wanted to ensure that the chimpanzees were permanently retired to sanctuary. So this amendment passed in December of 2007 and was supported by lots of different animal welfare groups. At this time, the breeding moratorium, which I mentioned earlier, where the government said, you know, we're going to temporarily stop breeding chimpanzees, it was made permanent in 2007. So there is no breeding of chimpanzees. There hasn't been since then. Then there was another amendment proposed in 2013, which would lift the lifetime cap on spending because we had reached that in 2013. But this amendment also removed funding for construction at the sanctuary. So any additional construction at Chimphaven has to be 100% supported by us. So we have to do fundraising for any additional construction. So as Erica was saying, lots of the sanctuaries need more space, need to build in order to take more primates. But this removed any sort of federal funding for Chimphaven for construction. It did open the possibility of additional government-supported sanctuaries in the future. So we go back kind of to the Endangered Species Act. And I had mentioned that captive chimpanzees were split listed and they were considered a threatened species rather than an endangered species. In 2013 and 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife reconsidered and opened public comment. And then in June of 2015, chimpanzees were no longer split listed and captive chimpanzees actually received endangered species status. This is really important because it really impacted what people could do, how they would use chimpanzees, especially those pets and entertainers. And it also led to another decision, which was the end of biomedical research with chimpanzees in the United States. In June 2013, NIH had announced the retirement of all but 50 chimpanzees. They withheld 50 chimpanzees sort of for a just-in-case situation if they were needed for some sort of biomedical research. And then after the Endangered Species Act listed them as endangered, in 2015, NIH decided that they would retire the remaining 50 chimpanzees. So this led to a big change, as you can see here, between 1985 and 2018. Chimpanzees were mostly housed in research facilities in the United States. And then that kind of changed right here around 2017, 2016. And now Chimphaven is the largest chimpanzee sanctuary in the world. This is sort of a timeline of some of these things that I've already talked about, where we were incorporated in 1995. Chimp Act was signed. We did construction starting in 2002 because of the Chimp Act providing that funding. And you kind of see that over time, it took us 10 years from the time we were incorporated to the time the first chimpanzees arrived. But the Chimp Act was obviously instrumental in this in terms of providing funding. So when a chimpanzee comes to Chimphaven, the transport planning actually begins months in advance of our transports. We have calls with our sending facilities as well as National Institutes of Health representatives. Records are exchanged between the facilities and reviewed by staff. And then we also have to work with a transporter to figure out, the best time for the chimpanzees to come. It gets very hot in Louisiana, where Chimphaven is located, so we don't do transports typically in the summer. And then the chimpanzees also undergo pre-transport physicals. Once they get to Chimphaven, they go through an acclimation and quarantine period before they're introduced into our larger population. And during that time, our team is getting to know the chimpanzees, watching them, doing behavioral observations, and making decisions about maybe where the best place would be for the chimpanzees to be integrated into the population and meet new friends. This is just a graph of the number of chimpanzees transferred to Chimp Haven over from 2005 to 2024. So over almost the last 20 years, and you can see those spikes when we first kind of got started, and then after the amendments in 2013 and the decision in 2015, 2016. And now sort of most of the chimpanzees have been transferred to sanctuary. There are still a few remaining in biomedical research facilities that were determined by the sending facility and NIH to be unable to retire to sanctuary, to come to Chimp Haven. So today we do have over 300 chimpanzees, and we have multiple mixed sex groups. Our age range is 7 to 64 years. We did have some very young chimpanzees that retired to Chimp Haven from biomedical research, but we have also had some unplanned babies. I mentioned that there's a breeding moratorium, so all of the male chimpanzees are vasectomized at Chimp Haven, and the females are on birth control. But just like in people, there can still be some babies, so we've had a few. We do have other chimpanzees from privately owned sources, and as I mentioned, those chimpanzees are not supported by the National Institutes of Health. We have to raise all the funds for those chimpanzees. This is just an overview of Chimp Haven. You can see these are some of our forested habitats, and you can see we have multiple buildings. We have vet clinics in all of our buildings and different areas for socialization as well. So what's next? Short and long-term planning for the potential for more chimpanzees to come to Chimp Haven. And if that's going to happen, we would potentially need to do additional construction to be able to house those additional chimpanzees. So those are conversations that our board of directors and our team, as well as NAPSA and Erica, are all having at this point in time. Thank you so much for your attention and for having me today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And now we'll turn it over to Tim.
Okay, let me see if I can get my side working now. Okay, can everybody see that? Am I sharing?
We see your face.
Oh no, let's switch that up. Hold on just a second. Okay, so it didn't share. Hold on here. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. Share screen.
Okay, take your time. And I can pull it up.
Let's try it this
if
way.
that works.
How about now?
Not yet.
Still me. Okay.
Do you want me to pull it up on my end?
No, you shouldn't need to. We did this earlier. Share,
When the computers.
share, share the screen. Sharing. Okay, how about now?
We can see your desktop. So now,
Okay, great. Now, here we go.
perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. And then I need to move you around because I can't see the screen. All right. Okay, sorry for that delay. I'm Tim Ajax. I'm the executive director for the Oklahoma Primate Sanctuary. And we've been around for 26 years as an incorporated nonprofit. And we currently house 94 monkeys, and about 36 of those have been directly retired from research. And we have several of them up in their 30s. So we think we're doing something right. What I wanted to do today was just kind of go over with you what happens when the monkeys show up at the sanctuary. And with that, we'll just get going here. So the first thing we want to look at is what are our goals? Why are we doing this? And the first thing that comes up, of course, is we want to provide a quality lifetime care. What does that mean? Well, for a monkey, it means providing an environment that allows for expression of natural behaviors, exploration, foraging, a room to roam. All of these monkeys have spent a good portion of their time in a laboratory in 32-inch lab cages, which they're just really not designed as a species to do. We want to make sure that they have access to proper veterinary medical care without undue disruption to their lives. So these guys have been poked and prodded throughout most of their laboratory lives. And if they see you coming with a needle or a net or anything that looks like gloves, a lot of them get highly stressed and will start alarm calling, etc. So we go to quite some extremes to if they need to come in for an injury or an illness or for a routine exam, we want to make sure that that process is stress-free as possible. And then, of course, we want to provide opportunities for socialization. While I think labs overall, in my conversations with them, have gotten better about pair housing, cage, and group housing, which happens much less frequently, they still, for the majority of their life in the lab, live in singly housed. And lastly, we want to make sure that we allow for a humane end of life. Every monkey who comes to the sanctuary at some point is going to die. So we want to make sure that they've had a good quality of life while they're here, and that the ending is as humane and painless and stress-free as possible. Then the other goal is to encourage retirement as a norm, not an exception. As Erica said earlier, only a very small fraction of the animals actively being utilized in research get to experience retirement. Almost all of them go into terminal studies or repurposed to other studies. And we want to change that so that more of these monkeys get to experience retirement. And of course, as both Amy and Erica have also mentioned, that requires funding that we simply don't have at this point for monkeys. And one of the things that we would like to see happen is that NIH somehow set up and designate a retirement per diem, so that every animal involved in research, regardless of species, has some per diem set aside, a daily amount for the retirement. If that animal cannot be retired for good reason, then the money rolls over into a retirement account and can be utilized to retire other animals. Because right now, at least for the monkeys, which tend to be not as highly charismatic, funding is hard to come by. So let's get what happens when they show up. This is Itchy, and this is when he first arrived here. So these monkeys have been transported hundreds, if not thousands of miles, typically by air because it's less expensive, but sometimes via ground, which is much more expensive, takes quite a bit longer. But they get to come to our door instead of us having to show up at the airport to pick them up. But he was very inquisitive when he came in, and wasn't really stressed. But many of them can be highly stressed when they come in. They hide in the back corner of the transport cage. They stop eating, etc. So when they get here, we have to kind of take a careful look at them and see what's happening behaviorally before we just take them out of the crate and get going. And so that first step is decompression. So oftentimes we'll see if they're hiding a lot, we may cover the whole crate. We may offer grapes. One of the things that we don't do with monkey species is make direct eye contact, because that can be viewed by them as very threatening. So we always have our side to them. We talk in low, gentle tones, give them maybe a couple of grapes and so on, and just see how they're behaving, how they're reacting, try to get them settled in. And then we also always encourage the primary caregiver at the lab, or at least someone that monkey knows, to accompany them. So that can help during the initial transition from lab life to sanctuary life, if they have that familiar person with them. And so the next step is, this is their new life. And there's a settling in process, and it can be really stressful. Despite where they've come from, they're used to that. And similar to people, we get used to things being a certain way. And even if it's not always the greatest thing, we're used to it. and change can be stressful and scary, even when it's positive change. So when we initially let them out into their enclosure, a lot of times this is the first time these monkeys have ever touched grass. They've typically been bred in a corn crib on cement. And so some of them are really fascinated with the grass and will immediately pick on it. And others walk very gently, may touch it and get back on a crate. It's really interesting to see how each one of them responds, but eventually they all settle in. But it's just kind of heartbreaking to witness that, where, you know, you have an animal species that should have been born to the grass and trees and so on. And this is the first time in their life, sometimes 20 years in a laboratory, and this is the first time they've ever touched grass. So the new space compared to what they've lived in for years can be really overwhelming. We call this the fishbowl effect. So we put up a lot of visual barriers, and this process can take sometimes weeks, sometimes even months, for them to really adjust and become themselves in this new environment, because they have open sky, above them. They birds and all these sounds, and then strange people walking by, strange monkeys are talking to them, and so again, it's really stressful for them. And then others, they can really settle in quickly. So every one of these guys is an individual, and we have to treat them that way and assess them each as an individual. We noticed that transitioning from Lixit devices, which is typically what they use in the caging system in the laboratories, happens really quickly. So give them a little play tub with water. We use buckets for our waters that can be empty from outside the enclosure to minimize any potential contact with them. And they'll dive right into the water and get playing. So that's a very natural behavior that's quickly expressed. Then there's new faces, new routines. And again, these monkeys, some of them, for some of them, they have never even seen some of the species we have out here for across the way. So they may be in an area where, 100 feet away, there's a capuchin. And so they can become really enamored and really interested in a capuchin, and not so much in the other monkeys, macaque species. So there's a lot of nonverbal expressions coming from the other monkeys in the area too. There's some basic sounds that they make and basic communicative sounds that they make, but a lot of it is posture and facial expressions, ears back, ears forward, mouth open, canines covered, all of these kind of interactions that are occurring. And those are somewhat similar to what they've experienced in the lab environment. In the lab environment, they're housed in single cages, but they're in a room with other monkeys. And so they express all of these nonverbal behaviors across the way at each other. And some of them try to dominate without ever touching, and others, try to shrink away. So it's really interesting when they first get here and are first put out in the enclosure, who they may form an interest in. And then they have to get used to the caregivers. And so all the caregivers, the human faces are new. Monkeys can be similar to us in that, for whatever unknown reason, they may just take an initial dislike to somebody or another monkey, even just because of the way they look, whether they have facial hair, their gender, all of these things can make a difference in whether or not they're friendly, or whether they take a dislike to caregivers. So on the caregiver side, we then have to make adjustments for that monkey. If he doesn't like Summer coming by every morning, then a different staff member will have to go ahead and make the feeding and cleaning. We try to stick with their previous diet. Normally that's not too difficult because they've been fed a commercial lab diet. And we also feed a commercial lab diet. But the big change for them is a daily infusion of produce. Typically we feed 2 vegetable items and a fruit item. We stay away from any sugary treats and so on. And then we also scatter forage all throughout their enclosure on a routine basis, so that they can get in there and start picking through the grass and foraging, which is part of their natural behaviors. And then introductions, actual physical introductions. This is probably the hardest part of new life at the sanctuary. And it's hard on them, and it's hard on us. Some monkeys are typically highly territorial, and instinctually they have these behavioral displays, but they lack context because they have not been raised in a proper troop and have not grown through that process. They don't always know how to behave. And these introductions between unfamiliar monkeys are really stressful, but we'll still continue. It's still our goal, even if it doesn't work out, because they're highly social animals and they benefit from close proximity to others of their kind, as well as affiliative behaviors such as grooming and hugging and so on. So it's really worth doing it, but it may take a long time. We have to be really careful because they're physically strong for their size. Most of these monkeys are under 40 pounds, but they're very strong for their size. The males have long canines. They are constantly sharpened on the back sides of their canines against their bottom canines and a special lower premolar. So the whole back side is like a very sharp saber. So monkeys use their face and their mouth and their teeth to express displeasure. And we have to be really careful because that's their primary means of defending themselves or becoming aggressive. And, some individuals are more socially motivated and accepting than others. So again, with the introductions, each one is handled on a case-by-case basis. And staff watches for behavioral clues. What happens is when one monkey stares at another monkey, does the other monkey turn away, avoiding direct eye contact? Does one monkey puff up and posture and start bouncing around? And then how does the other monkey respond? So typically, when you have a large male, if another male will submit behaviorally and say, okay, you're the boss, I'm okay with you being the boss, then typically introductions can advance fairly quickly. But when you have two males that insist that they're both top monkey, then things can get pretty dicey quickly. And so that's, again, why we have to carefully monitor the behaviors and to see who might go with who. And then we do it in a stepwise fashion. We don't just throw them together. It's a very dangerous practice to do that. So typically what we'll do is we'll remove visual barriers so they can see each other. We'll watch and record their behaviors, and then we'll get them closer to each other. We may use a howdy tunnel where they can get somewhat close to each other and start having interactions with their fingers. With rhesus macaque species specifically, in the males, what we found is that if they start fighting through the fence right off the bat, it's not going to get any better. We have never had a situation where they start fighting and 6 months later they're lovey-dovey and have a nice relationship. They hold grudges and they remember, and if they don't like another monkey, there's nothing we can do to make them like the monkey. So a lot of what we do is matchmaking, and we're horrible at it. We try this monkey with that monkey, and then eventually we go, well, let's try him with this monkey, and the one we put in last and never suspected that they would get along, boom, they get along. So it can be a long, arduous process, and it can also be a very short process. It can be very frustrating too, but the goals are still there. We still believe firmly in that group housing and minimum pair housing, and so they can express their normal social behaviors. So the rewards of all of this are in terms of sanctuary life, and in terms of getting these animals out of the lab and into the sanctuary. The rewards are freedom of movement. As I alluded to earlier, the 32-inch lab cages, sometimes for 10, 15 years. So freedom of movement is a big thing for all primates, humans included. Freedom from physical intrusion and constraint. These animals have not just sat idly by in the laboratory in a squeeze cage, getting fed and occasional treats. They've been actively utilized in research, and that means poking and prodding. Sometimes it means daily injections. It just depends on what kind of protocol that they've been placed in. So their freedom from that, they have the ability to socialize with others. And, a big thing for us, as I've observed over the years, is this environment. And let me back up. Some people will make the argument that, look, a cage is just a cage. You're just giving them a bigger cage. Well, technically that may be true, but if we had the choice between living in the bathroom with our favorite foods shoved under the door or having the whole house on the deck, I can tell you what I would choose. I would choose the whole house on the deck. I think most rational people would. And so this difference in size is important in terms of their environment, their living environment, but also putting yourself in their place. They've been for years in a climate controlled and light controlled a building. So the lights may come on at 7 a.m. and they go off at 7 p.m. and that, or whatever photo period that the lab has decided to utilize. And the amount of vocalization that occurs and the sounds that they hear are primarily their own, as well as lab workers. And then suddenly they get out here and there's bird songs. There's thunder in the distance. There's wind in their fur. There's insects and grass and birds going in and out of their enclosure, and there's sunshine and rain. And all of those things are absent in an indoor climate controlled environment. And so we think that this is a huge, huge part of their quality of life. What are some concerns about retiring monkeys to sanctuaries? Well, right off the bat, injuries and fightings may and do occur occasionally. So that's a concern. Nobody likes to see that happen. And I've talked to some lab personnel who insist that the risk is too great and will refuse to retire their animals because that may happen. Another excuse that I've heard is that initially highly stressful to move them. No, they can't handle it. Jojo, he'll just stress out too much. So, unfortunately, that animal will probably be humanely killed because they're concerned about a potential stressful event. And then a big one is, is the high cost of lifetime retirement. So right now, our annual cost of care averaged out for the number of monkeys we have is around $4,200 annually. Now, that may not seem like much, but when we ask for a lifetime care for these monkeys, that's a big chunk of money. And the way we do our request is that we take, for rhesus macaques, we take a median age of 22 years and we subtract however old they are. So if they're 10 years old, then that leaves 12 years times 4,000 a year. So all of a sudden you're looking at $48,000 initial costs up front to provide those lifetime care. And that can be a big deterrent to some of the labs retiring. But we're also in a position where we can't do otherwise. There are not enough foundations that directly fund operating costs for sanctuaries. We're completely out of room. We're completely full, and we can't accept any more monkeys right now until we have money to build an enclosure. Enclosure costs have gone up from $35,000 4 years ago to build an outdoor enclosure with warm house to over $85,000 today. So a lot has happened in the last few years in terms of costs, and that is also factored into the retirement costs. So those are, again, a big impediment to getting these animals out of the lab. So after all of that, is it worth the trouble and expense? Well, harken back to the guy picking up starfish and throwing them back into the ocean. Well, it's important to that one, and it's worth it to these monkeys. So absolutely, we think it is. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. And now we are going to go to some question and answers. We had a couple come in. One that came up was, do you think that zoos could be converted to sanctuaries? What would be the major obstacles to doing that? And what would be some primary funding sources when ticket sales aren't available as a revenue source for that?
It's a big question. I guess I'll start and just point out that one big difference, and first let me say there's some fabulous zoos that the sanctuary community works with regularly and we have a lot of respect for. But one big difference between zoos and sanctuaries is that zoos are open to the public and sanctuaries are not. And in the sanctuary world, that keeps animal welfare as the top and only priority. Enclosures are designed for the animal use and not necessarily viewer benefit. So it would require a philosophical change for a zoo to transfer over to becoming a sanctuary. That's the first thing that popped in my mind. But of course, funding through ticket sales is a benefit of zoos that sanctuaries don't have. And sanctuaries do have to rely on public donations and foundations, which, you know, Tim and Amy pointed out is not, it's not enough money right now. You all can add to what I said.
Well, I'll just agree with everything you said. And I think the big one is a philosophical change. You know, so zoos manage for collections, and you know, we manage for individuals. And you know, where would they get the funding in order to take care of these animals life for life without that gate? So it's almost like once you get established in a certain pattern of fundraising and a certain pattern of you know, getting your money, then you almost get married to it because your systems are tied into that approach. So I think it would be difficult.
Okay, that's really
Zoos
helpful.
also breed their animals, or at least most do. And yeah, and I guess Amy was going to say that. Amy, go ahead. I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the other philosophies of zoos is typically to breed animals, for especially those that are endangered species. And for sanctuaries, we don't breed. That's one of the philosophies of sanctuaries. So I think that would be another big philosophical change.
And Tim mentioned the cost of care for the animals that are at his sanctuary. Amy, could you speak to that as well? What the costs are that you experience?
Yeah, so our costs range typically around 23,000 a year per chimp. So it's a lot more expensive to take care of a chimpanzee, which makes sense because they require you know, really secure enclosures. They're larger, they're stronger, they eat more, and they also live, you know, into their 60s potentially. So all those things go into that.
And
There
Tim,
have
oh, sorry, go on, Erica.
There have been some studies too, and some papers that show that sanctuary care, as expensive as it can be, is still cheaper than animal care in laboratories. So that's a big consideration when you think about how money is spent and how efficiently it can be used to help animals.
And if you're considering the federal funding for chimpanzees, that's actually a cost savings to you all as taxpayers.
Awesome. We have some questions that also came through the Q&A. One of them was from Sarah. The question was, do you learn of a monkey's lab protocol to help you settle in that monkey? And do you see what you'd call PTSD in the monkeys, or would the lab technically euthanize such monkeys or chimpanzees?
You want, oh, well, I'll answer for the monkeys. So typically we are not told of any protocols, and it's kind of a, you know, don't ask, don't tell. What we want from the laboratories is, look, do you have any medical concerns going forward? Do they have any implants? Are there anything that we need to be aware about with their, you know, medical and physical standing that we need to be alerted to watch and monitor down the road? That's what we're after. So no, we don't get the protocols. And in terms of PTSD, what we see in primates, it has become less and less from retired monkeys. We see it in every single ex-pet monkey, and it can be extremely disturbing. So one of the reasons we believe is because about 15 years ago or 20 years, I could be a little off on that, researchers started becoming really concerned about how their data was being ruined basically by PTSD within the laboratory setting. And so what they found is that if they, when they're breeding these monkeys, if they let the babies within the natal group that they, you know, their siblings and their mom, for at least 6 months to a year before they culled them for research, that they were much more stable monkeys, much more behaviorally approachable and sound. And that correlates to what we see in the pet trade, because those monkeys are ripped from their mothers at sometimes days old, which is highly traumatic. and then put in a human household. They don't grow up with other monkeys. And so again, their level of PTSD is extremely high. We call it self-directed behavior. Sometimes it's self-injurious behavior, but they'll chew on themselves, they'll bite themselves, they'll spin in circles, and display all types of disturbing stereotypies.
And for the chimpanzees, Amy, is that something, I know that it's being phased out, but did you see that earlier as chimps were moving on to the sanctuary?
We definitely see abnormal behavior in the chimpanzees. And as Tim was talking about, rearing is a big deal in terms of how the chimpanzees were reared. So if we have a chimpanzee that was reared in a nursery, they are actually more likely to get wounded during introductions. They don't do as well during introductions. And I completely agree with Tim. The former pets are really hard. They typically have the most abnormal behaviors and are the hardest to socialize as well.
Thank you. Well, we've run out of time, but we had a lot of other questions that came through. So if Tim, Amy, and Erica, if you're open to it, audience members can email you from the emails that addresses that you put on your PowerPoint at the end. And then perhaps those answers can come through that chain. So thank you each so much for this presentation. It was so informative and empowering.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you all
thank
for
you so
attending.
much.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.